When my mother remarried, I thought life would finally feel complete. A new family, a fresh start, something she deserved after years of struggle. My stepfather, Mark, was a kind man, and with him came Ethan, his son. Ethan was a few years younger than me, full of energy, always smiling, always looking up to me in a way that made me feel like an older sister, a guide. At first, everything felt normal. We bonded over shared dinners, late-night movies, and silly inside jokes. He became my little shadow, always hanging around, always eager for my attention. It felt good to have someone look up to me, to be part of a family again. As time passed, I started noticing things, small, barely significant on their own, but unsettling when pieced together. The way his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking. The way his compliments started feeling different. "You look beautiful tonight," he said once, his voice softer than before. I laughed it off, pretending it was just a casual remark. Then came the touches. Nothing inappropriate, but enough to make me aware. A hand on my shoulder that stayed a little too long. Brushing past me in the kitchen, his fingers grazing my arm. Subtle, almost unnoticeable if I wasn't paying attention. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, we were family. He was my stepbrother. It was probably just a phase, a youthful crush he would grow out of. But doubt crept in when he started finding excuses to be alone with me. "Let's go for a drive," he'd suggest, even when there was nowhere to go. "Stay up a little longer, let's watch another movie," he'd insist, even when I was clearly exhausted. One evening, while on a family trip, we ended up alone by the bonfire. The others had gone to sleep, leaving just the two of us in the flickering glow. The night was quiet, the air heavy. Ethan sat closer than usual, his knee touching mine. "You ever feel like some things are just meant to be?" he asked suddenly. His voice was low, serious. I hesitated. "What do you mean?" He turned to me, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. The look in his eyes wasn't admiration. It wasn't the look of a younger brother idolizing his older sister. It was something else, something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. My heart pounded. This was my stepbrother. This was wrong. I forced a laugh, shoving his shoulder playfully, pretending I hadn't caught on. "You're overthinking things, Ethan." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something had shifted, something I wasn't sure I could ignore anymore. I tried to convince myself that nothing had changed, that Ethan was just being a typical younger brother craving attention. But the more I ignored it, the harder it became to deny. His stares became more intense, his words more deliberate. Late at night, my phone would light up with his messages, random thoughts, inside jokes, but always ending with something that felt personal. "Wish we could talk like this all the time. You get me in a way no one else does." During family gatherings, he found ways to be close. He'd sit next to me, his arm brushing against mine. If I got up, his eyes followed me. When I spoke to someone else, I could feel his gaze burning into me. One night, at a birthday party, I was laughing with my boyfriend, Jason. He had his arm around me, telling some ridiculous story, completely oblivious to the way Ethan was watching us. When I glanced over, our eyes met. He didn't look away. He just stood there, jaw clenched, his hands in his pockets. Later that evening, I was in the kitchen grabbing a drink when I felt someone behind me. I turned, and there he was, closer than he needed to be. "You're really into him, huh?" His voice was calm, but something about it made my stomach tighten. I forced a smile. Of course. Why wouldn't I be? Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned against the counter, watching me. "He doesn't deserve you," he said finally. "You know that, right?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Ethan, stop. You're being ridiculous." But he didn't smile. "I mean it." There was something in his tone, something that made my heart race. I grabbed my drink and walked away before he could say anything else. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed our conversation in my head. Was I imagining things? Reading too much into it? But then I thought about the way he looked at me, the way his voice had changed. The next morning, I woke up to a text from him. "We need to talk." Alone. I ignored it. For the next few days, He kept his distance, but I could feel the tension thickening between us. And then, just when I thought he had finally let it go, he cornered me in the hallway, his expression unreadable. "I can't keep this to myself anymore," he said. "I need you to know how I feel." I stood frozen. "I love you," he whispered. "Not like a sister. Not like family." My breath caught. The air between us was suffocating. I wanted to say something to stop this before it got worse. But before I could, he turned and walked away, leaving me with a truth I didn't know how to handle. I avoided Ethan for days, pretending I hadn't heard him, pretending things could go back to the way they were. But deep down, I knew they couldn't. His confession had changed everything. Then came the night I could never forget. The house was quiet, my parents were out, and Jason had left after dropping me off. I was alone, at least I thought I was. I had just stepped into my room when I heard a knock on my door. I already knew who it was before I even opened it. Ethan stood there, eyes unreadable, his hands clenched at his sides. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied, keeping my tone firm. "You need to stop this, Ethan. It's not right." He stepped inside before I could stop him, closing the door behind him. "Don't say that," he murmured. "You feel it too. I know you do." I backed away, my heart pounding. "You're wrong." "Am I?" He took another step forward. "Then why didn't you tell anyone? Why haven't you pushed me away?" I opened my mouth, but no words came. I hated that part of me had been drawn to the attention, to the forbidden edge of it all. But this wasn't a game. This was real, and it was dangerous. "Ethan, please," I whispered. His expression softened. "I just want to be close to you. Just once. And if you tell me to leave after that, I will." 1,000 reasons to stop this ran through my mind, but when he reached for my hand, I didn't pull away. He brushed his fingers against mine, hesitant, almost as if he were waiting for me to make the final decision. I should have told him to leave. I should have walked away. But instead, I let my guard down. The next moments blurred together, his arms around me, the warmth of his breath, the quiet desperation in the way he held me. It wasn't just attraction. It was something deeper, something neither of us had been able to admit until now. But the second it happened, I knew it was a mistake. I pulled away, shaking my head. "No. We can't do this." Ethan's face fell. "You don't mean that." "I did." I had to. I turned away from him, unable to face what we had just done. This never happened. Silence stretched between us before he finally spoke, his voice hollow. "So that's it." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The door closed behind him, and as soon as he was gone, I collapsed onto my bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and I had no idea how to fix it. The days that followed were unbearable. I avoided Ethan at all costs, pretending nothing had happened, pretending I hadn't shattered the thin line between us. But the guilt was suffocating, and the silence between us only made it worse. He tried to talk to me, but I shut him down every time. I told myself it was for the best, that we had made a mistake, that it would pass. But Ethan wasn't letting go. His texts became desperate. "Please, just talk to me. You can't act like this didn't happen. Tell me you didn't feel anything." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Jason noticed the change in me. "You've been distant," he said one night as we sat together. "Is something wrong?" I forced a smile. "Just tired." He didn't buy it. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" I nodded, but my stomach twisted with guilt. How could I tell him? How could I admit that the person I was supposed to see as a brother had become something else? That I had let it happen? Ethan wasn't handling it well. He barely spoke at home, barely looked at me. When our parents were around, he forced a smile, but I could see it wasn't real. And when we were alone, the silence between us felt heavier than ever. Then came the breaking point. A family dinner, everyone gathered at the table, laughter filling the room. I was sitting next to Jason, his hand resting on mine, a picture of normalcy. But across the table, Ethan was watching. He didn't say a word, but his eyes told me everything. After dinner, as I stepped outside for air, Ethan followed. "So that's it?" he asked, his voice quiet but sharp. I didn't turn to face him. "It has to be. You can just forget? Move on like nothing happened?" I exhaled slowly. "I don't have a choice." He let out a hollow laugh.
Right.
"Because he's the better option, right? Because this, whatever this is, was just a mistake." I finally looked at him. "It was a mistake, Ethan. It never should have happened." His jaw tightened. "You don't mean that." I held his gaze. "I do." For a long moment, he just stared at me. Then he nodded, a bitter smile forming on his lips. "Got it." He walked away without another word, and I knew in that moment that I had lost him, not just in the way he wanted, but as family, as a friend. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized the truth. Some mistakes can be forgiven, but not all wounds heal. Some lines, once crossed, change everything. And no matter how much you want to undo the past, some things are lost forever.